Okay, I think I'll go ahead and get started this morning. Mike, do you mind starting actually the PowerPoint for us this morning? And let me just welcome everybody. I know we have several people joining us this morning virtually. And last night, and so go ahead and start, Mike, and I'm going to kind of run through some of the slides that we looked at last Thursday so that I can provide some updates based on the information that came out late yesterday. So this was evening reading last night, quite exciting. This is just as a reminder, our organizational structure for the task force. We do have our medical consultant, head of nursing, board of education, all the members of cabinet, so that as we're working on all of these different components, everybody has kind of their unique area, their specialty. Next slide. These are the focus groups area. And again, this is a reminder for those people who may be watching for the first time or did not see last week's meeting. We do have the health advisement, of course, which is critical in this process, looking at our scheduling complexities. And that alone is a huge task. Transportation, food service, athletics, and activities, the communications planning, our facilities, which includes disinfecting and cleaning, human resources, staffing, and health-related challenges, curriculum and instruction, which also includes the professional learning, and special education, our EL students, and all of our unique learners. And just the next slide is just the visual of how the task force actually operates. So we are meeting today, we're that dark blue right in the middle. We're looking at our goals that are around this group, and then our information comes from all of these different focus groups that are on those outer circles. And again, we want each person really focused in on, from those focus groups, their specialty areas. So the newest information, was just released late yesterday. And the plan from the state of Connecticut is called Adapt, Advance, Achieve, Connecticut's Plan to Learn and Grow Together. And the #1 overarching priority is plan to have all students in all districts return to schoolhouses for full-time instruction at the beginning of 2020-2021. Now, that alone is a very, very big statement and a shift from previous documents that we've had. And it really is the emphasis of all students, all districts, and full-time instruction. And in this document, it also emphasizes cohort groupings. And a cohort group, for those of you who haven't been following the language, what they're really talking about is just groups of children or students who stay primarily together throughout the day. In elementary, it's pretty easy for us to visualize because most of our elementary classrooms are what we would consider a cohort, or perhaps if you have 3 sections of 5th grade or 2 sections of 5th grade, all of those sections can become a cohort. We still need more clarification on what is the cohort grouping size. Are they talking about inside cohorts of 50? Or are we talking about inside cohorts of 150? And that has not been, for me, clarified as of this document. Also, our preparedness to adapt to remote learning. So although that they do say all students, all districts, full-time, they remind us several times throughout this document that within a day, we need to be able to transition to what they're calling remote learning. We've been calling it distance learning, but through this document, it's considered remote learning, same thing. And this document does distinguish between guidance and requirements. And I think that's a move in the right direction because it was very confusing with some of the other documents. Was it really, were things a local decision from the governor and the commissioner, or were they just guidance? Because there's a big difference in what we are being told we must do and where we have local control and local choice. Let's go on to the next slide. So curriculum and professional learning, this is a new requirement, but it's really not new for us in that we were already planning. We knew we were going to need additional training. And, you know, I spoke about this last Thursday, that even talking about perhaps adjusting our calendar by 1 or 2 days to get our professional days at the beginning, simply because we have curriculum training that we always do to make sure we stay up to date. But now we're adding mandatory training for staff before the beginning of the school year, which means when teachers are back before the kids, that covers signs and symptoms of COVID-19, the standard public health protocols, hygiene practices, PPE, reporting illness, and then also supporting social emotional learning. And a lot of these also tie into that communications plan we talked about last Thursday, where we will have some small videos, for instance, about how children move around the building. How do we help them, what's the proper way to wear a mask or to wear a shield? Or if you're wearing a shield, do you also need to wear a mask? And this document does address that a little bit. But again, it's just understanding that this now is a requirement, even though we were planning on it. It's very specific in that these areas must be covered on top of the actual just building protocols and what doors we enter and things of that nature. The next slide, please. Transportation. This was our previous guidance on transportation. And I will say transportation is one that I'm a little perplexed about, and I have probably more questions than answers today. But our previous guidance that I was sharing last Thursday, and this comes from CDC, and then the state had put this out for us, had a maximum of about 12 children on a bus, a big yellow bus, in order to socially distance when you're also on a bus, which of course was very complex. The new guidance last night, if you go to the next slide, basically has 3 different levels. You have safe status, low status, and moderate status. Safe status is just hop on the bus like we always do. Low status is hop on the bus like we always do with a mask. And then moderate status looks more like the slide we just saw before, where we're back to social distancing. Right now, my understanding where they believe that we are, and I don't know, and when we take some questions, Mary Keller may be able to weigh in on this. I believe right now we're considered at the low status by the way that they have set this newest document and wearing masks on buses. But again, it's a little perplexing, I think, for families, for teachers, for everybody, because we will talk about social distancing. The document talks about social distancing, whether that's 3 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet. But then on a bus, if we're going back to normal, we're talking about 3 children sitting in 1 seat. There is no social distancing. So if you're not going to social distance at all on the buses, it's a little perplexing that we're social distancing in the building. And so I think we're going to need some really clear health guidance to help everybody feel comfortable about where we are. Okay, next slide. Food service, there are really no changes other than the cohort groupings. They use that word cohort. And this, again, will be a local decision about the status of COVID, social distancing, and it could even be different building by building according to the space challenges, whether or not children are eating in the classroom or they're in the cafeteria with social distancing. And as I was in a discussion just in the last really 24 hours about this, one thing to consider is how big a cafeteria is, and again, what is the cohort grouping? If a cohort grouping is 50, then the number of lunches you would need to get kindergarten, for instance, through 5th grade, it would take you so long just to do all those rotations that it may be more prudent to actually be eating in the classroom, just even to gain instructional time and to make sure the building operates more effectively. Obviously, as you go up middle school and high school, it's going to look different at every level, but it's a local decision. And this new document, the next slide, is the athletics activities return to play. There really are no changes here. The one item I did put in red was temperature taking, who monitors, and that this could change. It really, in the document, is left a little bit open in the CIAC document, but since you'll see in a minute, they're no longer requiring temperatures to be taken when you enter the school with this newest document, it is unlikely that we would in CIAC with our sports or activities require temperatures to be taken. On the facilities and disinfecting and cleaning, again, these were the cleaning products I talked about last week that we're ready to go with. There were no changes here. Our chemicals are safe and non-toxic, and we have the ability to produce 200 gallons a day so that we have easy distribution in and around our district. So we are in a good spot with our disinfecting. Next slide. Our paper towel dispensers, they do talk in this document again about trying to be as touchless as much as possible. And this is the dispenser where you pull down the towel and then another towel dispenses right behind it, so nobody has to actually touch the units. Next slide. And here are just a few changes. When we talk about the PPE equipment, masks are required for all students and staff when they're inside the school building, with certain exceptions. And this is a change. And again, it's required for all students and all staff, and when they're inside the school building. And I want to be very clear, this is not Greenwich Public Schools saying that we are requiring, this is required by the state. And I say that just because I know it's a contentious issue, and that many people believe it's going to be very difficult to have 8-year-old children wearing masks all day. When we look out on Greenwich Avenue, and we know a lot of adults struggle to wear masks as well. So there are exceptions, and the exceptions are those children who may find it stressful, those young people who have some sort of breathing disorder, or simply high anxiety. You know, it could be really any reason that a family would reach out and say, my child, you know, cannot wear a mask. And it's not really designated that it necessarily has to come from a doctor, and there's no specific reason. So this will be a little complex when we go back. I do believe there'll be differences of opinion. The hand sanitizer ordering for all the classrooms, we did share it last week that we were planning to do that. It is now required, so we are ahead of the game on that. The temperature stations, I talked a little bit about that last Thursday, and we were holding off on, you know, ordering tents and the entries into the building because we didn't know if that really would be required, and partly because in a school the size, for instance, of Greenwich High School, it becomes almost unmanageable trying to imagine when you have 3,000 students trying to take temperatures right when they walk in the door. But it's no longer required. Doesn't mean we don't want the thermometers available, because it could change at any point if the COVID-19 has an uptick, and the document does talk a little bit about that. The next one, safety and security. So social distancing, again, all of our floor adhesives, we're ordering that. It does talk about the containment planning, identifying an isolation room in the building. And our summer document actually has this in it as well. And so we're already with summer school, we're trialing this, and it really is just having a space so that if you think a child or a student is ill, that you can actually have them in isolation until someone can come and pick them up. It's not really greatly different than what we would do during flu season, obviously. Human resources and staffing. Really no changes here, but I think the number one, do we have adequate staff to meet social distancing guidelines? And this one is a little tricky in the newest document, because they encourage us to use cafeterias and libraries and making more small groupings, but there's not really a strategy for who teaches those children. So if we make 20 more groups and we don't have 20 more teachers, we're not allowed to put them, you know, with professional assistants. It has to be with certified teachers. So that part is a little tricky. It will also be interesting to watch, again, as we study the document, and coming back, if you're talking about full-time and what social distancing actually looks like, how many of our staff are going to choose perhaps not to return. Next slide. And this also goes for our families. So you'll see in red, we have a family survey about bus ridership and comfort returning to school that we'll launch this week, and also our survey to our teachers. And we're just trying to get an idea of how many staff, how many students say that they're not going to be comfortable with this full return all student approach, and what it means for social distancing or not. And we will be assessing this. Nationally, they say the expectation is about 20% of families, 20% of teachers, but we don't know in Greenwich until we ask. So those are going out this week just to give us our first indication how high or how low that number will be. On the next slide, really there were no changes in this document for special education and our unique learners, or EL. It really is just making sure we have a strategy for PPT and evaluations that were much slower. I'm not going to say put on hold. We tried to get through those when parents requested them, but we definitely have a little bit of a backlog and trying to get caught up with those so that families feel supported as we go into September. And then of course, assessing the rate of learning, which is that number 3, that will be critical. And there's a whole section in this new document just on the academic aspect and assessment. And I feel like, again, we're a little bit ahead of the curve of what they put in that document because we have a system ready to go for K-8 especially. Next slide. So school scheduling. Full return, hybrid approach, and distance learning. Those are still the three key schedules that we must be ready for. Full return versus hybrid. Right now, we're trying to understand this new document and what does full return actually mean? Because if we look at full return, and I'm going to use the high school as an example with 3,000 students, even if we have somewhat of a staggered schedule and every student is there every day, we will not have a social distancing that could reinforce probably even 3 or 4 feet. And so we have to go into that cognizant and aware. A hybrid approach means that you're in school, you've basically split your school in 2 sections or 3, and some students they're there on some days and some are there on other days. And figuring out what the actual requirements are for a health and safety standpoint, and is going to be the tricky one there. The other thing that we don't really know is that it's not very clear from the state right now about distance learning. And are we back to where we were last March, where if we feel, let's say we're second week into school and we feel like it's starting to have an uptick, for instance, in New York, like it did last time, and Greenwich was the first school district that actually went to distance learning because it was right here on our border, our neighbor. And if that were to happen again, do we actually have to apply for a waiver? Or are we building a schedule for September that is what the community, the Board of Education, our staff, our students, what we feel is best for Greenwich? Or is it really going through an approval process? There is a plan that has to be submitted by July 24th. When you read the document, they're not really approving the plan. It's like it's just sitting at the state. But again, it's not really clear about what are our choices in scheduling if we are supposed to also be social distancing. The other thing about this plan is it says parents may voluntarily choose to temporarily engage in learning at home. So we must also have a simultaneous plan that will allow, let's say it was 20% of our families, that allows them to stay engaged in distance learning. And I know we've already been discussing that and making sure that we have distance learning available for families that would opt out, but now it's a requirement, where before it was us thinking that we needed to have that option. Now it is required. Next slide. So, you know, I just want to say we do have a commitment to ongoing, transparent, and timely communication. And we're going to continue to let our community know everything that we know. And as we're going through this process, being that the plan must be at the state by July 24th, we need to make a lot of progress in the next 3 weeks. So it's going to even move faster over these coming weeks. And we do want people to continue to, you know, look at the family notes that come in the email. We, on our website, right on the main page, greenwichschools.org, you just scroll down a little bit on the page and you'll see there's an icon right there. So it's on our front page, easy to find. You can click into that. You can find these meetings. Information will be posted right there. We are also on Facebook, on Twitter. There are a lot of different avenues to get information. When I say Facebook, I encourage people to either look at the Greenwich Public School Facebook or to look at our webpage, because I do know just from some of the questions that I even received since last Thursday that sometimes misinformation, believe it or not, happens on Facebook, on pages where people will post things because they heard something from somebody else who heard it from somebody else. For instance, yesterday, somebody reached out to say, it's going around right now that high school's not going to be back in school at all. And I was like, oh, okay, that is just a rumor. We will have our kids, you know, back in school, but it's real important that the information come from the district, and then take that information and post it and say, here's what's on the district website. And if everybody can help us do that, I think it will help alleviate some fears and some concerns, because I know people are really nervous about this whole return. Behind this, I just have, again, the focus group input dates. I've added a couple of those that were suggested. The task force dates, go ahead, Mike, to the next one. This does have the specialist group on there. It has the special education focus group. We also have the Q&A in Spanish. So those dates were all added. And then the last slide just has that link straight to our webpage on here for those people who are looking for it. And that's the next slide, Mike. And so I'm going to stop now. This is a 50-page document that we could spend like 3 hours on. But I think what I just tried to do was go through and highlight what some of the major changes are. And I think now I'll start with questions and from people on the panel. And I would like to start with one question from Katie and Mary. From the health standpoint, I think one aspect that is confusing, I think for many of us, is what is the social distancing? What are the health professionals saying about social distancing? Because what we hear economically on Greenwich Avenue, going to dinner, wherever, is that it's still 6 feet. But within the school, what I'm reading from this document is do the best you can. If it's 2 feet, that's okay. And so I think we're wanting to really measure, I think, the understanding of the health risk.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's still unclear in the document that we received last night that at one point it says social distancing to a minimum of 6 feet, but then it says when feasible. So I'm assuming, just from everything I've read, as close as I can determine, it's the best you can do. If you can't do 6 feet, then everybody should wear a mask. I agree that, it seems, that the whole busing situation is not the, where everybody's sitting right on top of each other and then you come in and then you're expected to distance. That seems to be in conflict of what they're saying. But my sense is that you do the best you can as far apart as you can possibly do in any classroom. But if you can't make the 6 feet, everybody wears a mask.
Yes, I mean, I would agree with Mary's comments. I think that, I'm a perfectionist and I know a lot of us are, but a lot of what we're reading is sort of like the good enough. We have to be doing our best, but it's not going to be perfect. And so I've read sort of 3 to 6 feet. I wanted to ask Tony, this mask requirement, is this like throughout the entire day? I've read so many different versions of that in all the documents that I've read. That's so concerning to me. I think compliance for students, if it has to be all day long indoors, they're going to go berserk. I can barely do it as a healthcare professional. It's horrible. It's horrible. I don't want to sound negative. I'm just being very realistic.
I think the educators agree with you, absolutely. And I think it's going to be a challenge. The way the document is written, I'll give you an example, like even on the low bus, and I had it down on the bottom of the slide. So you have to have a face covering just to board the bus if we're on that middle section, which is where we are right now. And then when they're in the building, they're supposed to wear it the way it's written right now, at least. And again, we just got this late yesterday. So obviously it was a pretty quick read last night, but as I went through and made notes on it, I highlighted masks are required for all students and staff when they're inside the school building. So the way that they have managed this overseas, I will say, is that once they have entered the building and the high kind of traffic areas, and they're back inside their classroom with their cohort of children that are together all day, that then they could then remove them. And
that seems like a reasonable approach.
Yeah,
that seems achievable to me. Keeping it on all day, forget it. Kids are not going to do that.
Yeah, go ahead.
And if we schedule some additional outdoor, activity, which it mentions the importance of getting outdoors as much as possible. And I think this will actually be a helpful mental health component of the return to school as well. And that will enable students to take their masks off for an additional period of time.
Yeah, I think we all recognize, and especially, and like you say, really, it's hard for adults. So I'm not sure that this is even a K-5 versus a high school issue, that if you're somebody like me too that wears glasses, like when I have my mask on, my glasses fog up. So I'm constantly taking them off, putting them back on. So I'm not the best example of a mask wearer in that I'm always taking my glasses off and trying to rearrange. But that's something that we need more clarity on, because the way that it is written just says inside the school building, and it's a requirement. I would think that as long as our local health professionals are advising us in that area and that we're safe, that hopefully that's an area where it should come to a little bit of local common sense about what works, because we know we're going to have so many, especially with the little ones, young ones, that their parents are going to opt out inside the classroom anyway, because they're going to feel like it's going to cause anxiety and facial issues and other things.
Tony, I have a concern though for our kids who are immune suppressed, or any child whose parent is worried. For all practical purposes, then kids are not wearing masks. Because if a child comes into the building and doesn't have it on, and I'm not saying we should send them home, but unless we're going to say you can't come into the building unless you have a mask on and send kids home, if I'm a parent of an immune compromised child, I just have to assume that people are not wearing masks, and that may cause more kids to stay home.
Yeah, I think the way that the document is written, that's accurate, and that it's required. However, a parent can opt out. Right. So you have to assume. Now, I think we would want to encourage, for those who, try to encourage parents who understandably don't want them to have it on all day long, to at least in those high traffic areas when they're entering in the morning, when they're exiting, to be able to have one on then. But there would be no guarantee by the way the document is written. Although interesting enough, like I say, on the bus, it actually says that if they don't have a mask on, they can't get on the bus. So, but even that's a little conflicting. They can't get on the bus without it, but some students can because their parents opted out. So those are some of the clarifying questions that are going to have to come from the state.
I would like to make a point. I think the actual numbers of truly immunosuppressed children must be very, very low. So, and these kids arguably probably wouldn't want to come to school anyways if they're truly immunosuppressed, they've been on chemotherapy or the like. So I'm not saying it's not a big problem, but I don't think these kids are going to want to come to school anyways. And I don't think the mask or no mask issue is going to be a deal breaker.
Thank you. Do we have questions from anybody else on the panel, cabinet, or our members on any of these? Instruction?
Oh, I have a quick question. Well, okay. A comment and a question. It's Karen Hirsch, by the way. I just wanted to make clear, because I know you said that there's some misinformation out there. As the board liaison and rep, people can certainly always email me at my board email address, which is, I'm sure, up there on the webpage as well. And I can also help make sure that proper information is being disseminated that way. But back to the quick question of masks. I know, having read through that document twice last night and a bunch of the supporting documents, it did say that masks were mandated even within the school building, and that there would be some medical exemptions. I'm sure we need a little bit more clarity on that from the state. And yes, I know that there are concerns about, especially our younger students, making sure that they have them on, which is why the document also discusses maintaining, teaching the students over the summer and beyond how to keep masks on and building up a tolerance. I know you mentioned, and one of the other things it talked about were face shields and plexiglass dividers. We no longer teach students in like a teacher at the front of the classroom and students facing forward model. We have a lot of tables. And I know you said over the summer we're going to be testing out some of the different face shields and or plexiglass. Is that something that we're going to be looking into for students who may not want to wear masks? I'm just more concerned that if we have immunosuppressed or educators who are concerned about their own health or bringing things home to their homes, or students bringing things home to immunosuppressed parents, that we're really cognizant of how we handle this, because I don't want there to be risks associated with that.
Yeah, so I do think it's going to be complex, because there are varying degrees of opinion about, wearing a mask, period. Some people don't really truly believe that it is necessary, and then other people, do. The way the document is written, even on when it talks about face shields, they still recommend that you wear a face mask under the face shield because the shield has the large opening on the bottom. Again, the health professionals could speak much better than I can, but have that large opening with the face shield. We did get the plexiglass dividers that sit on the desk for summer school, so we can see how those are working. But even with those, I was in I think it was this morning, we were in the discussion, Dr. Carabillo and I, about the small dividers and the cost at $180 a divider, and trying to calculate if you needed 4 or 5 of those in every classroom across the district, what is the actual cost even just to be able to get all of those. And looking at, from the way this document talks about plexi, we may have to be looking at different types of strategies, even for plexiglass. And we've been thinking about that. If you go to Home Depot right now, they have a lot of plexiglass, already has holes in it. There are ways to mount it, much more cost effective and larger. This document, I think it was this one, because I've read several in the last couple of days too, also talked about if a teacher was in front of the room, having the larger plexiglass that the teacher is actually behind, so that their mask is off. Because one of the discussions I've been in recently also is that it's very difficult to teach with the mask, and really not only just the audible aspect of understanding what the person is saying from a teaching standpoint where you really need clarity, but also children that need the facial expressions, and they need, to see the teacher smile, and they need to see a child who may actually need to see their lips if they are hearing impaired. So lots of complex issues that come along just with the plexiglass.
Thank you. That was going to be my next question about students who need to be able to have facial cues, be able to read lips, and being able to hear the teachers, especially if we need to do. And I know you'll get down to it when we get to the hybrid models. As the document was very clear that parents who have concerns about sending their children back can opt to continue with distance learning, and how we will be able to handle that. I know between teacher contracts and I don't know if there's been any discussion at the state, if they've spoken to unions to discuss allowances for educators to be recorded or film classes, if anything needs to be live streamed for students who remain home, because I know that there's privacy issues and students would need to sign any waivers, et cetera. And I can hold that for later, but that was one of my questions.
Right now, we're in that discussion. We've got to really make a hard decision about live streaming from a classroom comes with a whole different set of complexities. And number one, can the infrastructure of the district, if we really were fully back in school, live streaming every classroom, we're not sure that the infrastructure could actually do that. And how is the live streaming? If you're using, for instance, an iPad, or you have some type of camera, what is the audio quality? What is the video quality? We realize teachers may not be as mobile as they normally would be, and that may be something we'll have to acknowledge. But I was on a call just last Friday where we were discussing, it was several of the districts in this region, just the streaming issue, that when everyone is trialing it, it's difficult to understand in a big classroom, what is the type of equipment that a teacher actually needs, so that the person at home can really understand, can understand the person if they're moving around and inside a large classroom. And if we're not going in that direction, then it's also looking at what distance learning looks like, because we expect that we're going to have a team of educators that are also going to want to be distance learning or remote learning educators because of medical reasons. And those teachers may very well be forming kind of our hybrid team that is actually working with children. So if I'm a second grade teacher, and for whatever reason I have a health issue that I really want to be at home, I could take second graders from all around the district in my class, not just from my school. So we're looking at that as well. And it may be a combination between the live streaming and also distance learning team. But the next 3 weeks, those are some of the questions we have to really nail down. And part of it will be understanding the number of students and number of staff that are wanting to come back. But none of us saw the July 24th date actually coming. We would have, most of us in the region from a superintendent standpoint would have thought it would have been in August. So we're going to have to move a little bit faster in the next 3 weeks than we anticipated.
And then I guess since you're speaking about dates, the last question I'll have at this moment is, I know, for instance, parents at the preschool level were being asked to decide by July 7th if they were to be accepting their spots at preschool in town and so forth. I'm not entirely sure how they'd be able to do that if we really don't have any guidance or haven't given any information to those parents as to how preschool might be run. So just a consideration when we're discussing dates.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Anybody else have questions? I can't see everybody. I'm trying to see if you can use the raise the hand if I miss you. Katie, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I have another quick question. So in reading the report from the state, one of the concerns I had, it mentioned when we talk about cohorting groups of students in order to later on down the line perform contact tracing and better sort of contain disease. Then it mentioned that these cohorts, that there were some expectations that parents would abide by not mixing students outside of the same group. I think that's going to be very, very difficult to achieve. And on some level sort of infringes on people's personal lives and time, and not to mention the fact that we have in the same family students that represent different grades. So I just wondered if you might be willing to comment about that and how that might be messaged to parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's some of the clarity in this document that, again, I think it'll come down to good old common sense from a school district standpoint. We're not going to control families that if sports, for instance, are back in action, you have a sport cohort, you have a classroom cohort, you have a family cohort, you have a church cohort, families have all different kinds of cohorts. And I think from the common sense standpoint, it's going to be when they're in school with us, how can we mitigate and keep everybody as safe as possible by not having children going all over the building and mixing with all 500 children. And when we're on the playground, can we have fewer numbers of children on the playground at a time so that they have more space to run and play, and then that cohort comes inside and the next cohort goes outside. That's that common sense piece that I think is going to have to prevail a little bit. Mary Ford.
Do we have any idea or can we create a kind of decision-making priority so that, if the first thing we're going to decide is we're going to go with cohorts of 10 kids with one teacher, then that leads us down a whole bunch of steps we need to take to go that way. Some of them, unless we kind of know and I can't think of what it would be, but like, we have to make this decision first and then these will follow underneath that. Because it seems kind of overwhelming to try and address everything for every possibility. So
yeah,
if we're going to go with cohorts of 10, then to me, it leads us to looking at teacher certification, because we have to figure out who can teach who what.
Yeah, so we really, again, we've got to get clarity on this document, because what is the safe grouping size and what is the indoor cohort? Is it 50? Is it 100? Originally with CDC document, it was groupings of 10 or 15 children. We can't have 15 children in elementary unless we're going to hire 60 more teachers, which is simply, that's not going to happen. So we know that we're trying to keep our class sizes around that 20-ish mark, so that if you had 2 classes that were cohorting together, 2 classrooms, that would be around 40 children. And right now, the number that I've heard, and Mary or Katie, feel free to chime in, is around 50 is where the number had been sitting indoors. So that's the piece that we really just have to gain clarity, I think, from the document, is what is the cohort size as far as what's being recommended that is safe. And once we know that, that'll help a lot. We've done a lot of the work in the background, I think, on the groupings. But Mary or Katie, I don't know if you have a different perspective where we are as of today on the size of an indoor cohort or grouping.
I think we are at 50. That was the last number I heard, with the possibility of going up to 150. Okay. I don't think we're at 150 yet, but the last number I heard was 50.
And that's for indoors?
Inside, yes.
Okay. So that, the other question we do have to answer is it's just how comfortable we are with those cohorts or classes of 20-ish kids, and you're trying to keep them within those smaller cohorts of 50 or 100, which for middle school would be like a team of students. that share their teachers, but then you're trying to not have that team go to PE or mix with another team or something of that nature. And if that's safe and we feel like that's safe, if we feel like it needs to be smaller, then we have to gain clarity on even a hybrid model and whether or not that's being allowed for school districts, because that really wasn't clear in the document either. And if, as you remember, the way that we had distance learning was because there was a waiver or an executive order that allowed it. It's not generally allowed. So when I read the document, I felt like there was a little bit of a push to get us all back in full time, even if we couldn't really social distance to the way that, say, in August, if it's 6 feet. And if that's the case, what does that mean as far as distance learning? Is that really a local decision or not? Because that part was not really clear in the document.
And I would think, though, that the larger our cohorts, the more likely we are to have to close down a cohort if somebody becomes exposed. So if you could keep the smaller numbers, means that you would only have to impact maybe 20 to 40 kids if somebody in there had secondary contact and they had to close down for 3 days. If you go to a larger cohort, you're impacting more kids and you have more possibility of kids coming in saying, my father works with somebody who has COVID or something like that. So I see the benefit staffing wise, but the smaller the cohort, I would think the less likely you are to have to close down for secondary contacts.
Yeah, it's definitely easier in elementary and a little bit more challenging in middle school and much more challenging in high school. And in just looking at the high school complexities of scheduling, and a little bit easier for freshmen than it is sophomore, juniors, and seniors, just the number of electives that are offered and the courses students take. And, we're having to really go in right now. They're not recommending, obviously, like live chorus, instruments where you're blowing. So some of those may have to be operated distance learning if we're going to have those electives, which are really important electives to a lot of our students. So in the high school, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, probably a little bit larger cohorts, obviously, than what we would see in elementary. When you've got a general ed classroom like elementary and they're together all day, that's much more simple than high school. Any other questions about any of these changes or the new guidance? Mark, Mr. D'Amico?
I had a question for our medical professionals, and it goes back to, and it's along the same lines as the plexiglass. In terms of encouraging the teachers to find time to get kids outside more often for fresh air, what kind of guidance has been given to you in terms of the practical handling and safe handling of the masks as they come on, as they go off? Where should kids be storing them? If we go out for recess, much like they do with their coats, they shed them and throw them into the grass or hang them on the park bench. What type of guidance would you think we would need to be planning for to make sure that those masks are intact at the end of a recess period or whatnot, and also to make sure kids are aware of there's certain parts of the mask you shouldn't be touching when you take it off and put it back on. So I was just hoping you'd give us a little insight on that.
Well, those are excellent questions. I think we have to, in a sense, sort of keep our expectations a little low on this front. I think we can do the very best that we can, but children are not little adults, and even adults have difficulty with some of these basic tasks. So I think we can educate our students through, video media or, class presentations, and maybe every student puts their mask in their pocket and they're responsible for that. And then they queue up and put their masks on before going back into the classroom. But I don't think a 7 or an 8-year-old is going to necessarily know not to touch the inside of their mask. I think we kind of have to let a little bit of that go and do the best that we can. And maybe that's, doesn't sound great, but it's just realistic.
I also think, Mark, that we can teach the students. I foresee that the in the elementary schools, the teacher's standing there and saying, "Okay, now we're going to start with the ears, and we'll pull it off. We're going to hold it." And if you do that repetitively every day before you go out, the students will learn how to take it off and put it out, put it down. If they put it on a corner of their desk and then go out and wash their hands, go out in the playground, play, come back, wash their hands. The teacher says, this is how we're going to put the mask back on. I have to agree that masks are tricky. I've been a nurse for 40 years and it's still, you know, the first few minutes I put that mask on, it annoys me incredibly, but as you practice, as you get used to it, it's just one of those things that you have to become adjusted to. So you eventually, you know, you eventually do it. But I don't think we should think along the lines of being punitive to anybody that doesn't wear a mask. If somebody forgets to wear a mask or a child puts their hand on their mask, you know, a gentle reminder is, I think, just the most we should be doing, that there shouldn't be anybody being disparaging to anyone who's having trouble with their mask. It's tough. Yeah.
May I ask, will there be a hand sanitizing station at the playground as you enter back into the building? Because that would be, you know, a great part of the protocol. Everybody gets their mask back on, they queue up, they get hand sanitizer, and then they come into the classroom. And then should somebody touch the inside of their mask by accident, which is likely to happen, given the fine motor skills of kids at all ages, then at least they've sanitized their hands. I think that's a practical solution.
Yes, we will have hand sanitizing stations, and we also will have that hand sanitizer in the classroom. So if the teacher notices something, they could also give them a little bit as well.
I'm sorry, it's Karen Hirsch. I know that there's so much anxiety around the use and the requirement of having masks for students and adults of all ages. Is this an area that maybe we could create some short videos to share with parents now so that they can start doing a little work at home with some of their students, make sure that they find a mask that their child finds comfortable before the start of the school year, and just be able to start a little of that prep work to just put some short videos together or anything?
Absolutely, and the kind of video trainings for young people and also for little kids are that's something that falls in Sasha's department, Houlihan, for communications, and making sure that they're short, you know, they're not too long, so the little one can watch them. As Mary Keller was doing this, I was imagining a teacher singing some little song. You know, we'll have to get really creative because I think with the little ones, that stuff really works. And so that is something that we will be working on over the coming weeks now that we have a little more clarity about what's going to be required.
I agree. And to the extent we can all use the same language with kids, so the videos would help with that. So we're all putting them on and taking them off the same way. I think it would get better compliance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. We have a few more minutes. Are there any more questions? We were trying to keep today's meeting with the hard stop at 11, but we do have about 10 more minutes if anybody wants to follow up on anything else that was in this document.
Is there any information we need to bring or have prepared for the next meeting? Are there specific questions we're going to be addressing?
Well, right now, what I'm trying to get is clarity on what came out, the things that aren't clear today. Hopefully we'll have more clarity for the next meeting. And then we'll be able to talk a little bit more. I really want to talk a little bit about scheduling, but we have to be able to get clarity before I can do that. So that's what I'm going to aim for Thursday. And if anyone has questions, to send those to me, you know, ahead of time, if there's something specific that you really want to discuss. Because what we do have to do, again, we've only got 3 more weeks before this will go to the state. So we're going to have to start the document that they're requiring is going to have to also start, and that will start taking us through the whole process of answering the questions for the state, even the trainings that we have to do. Now, Karen.
Sorry, the last questions. I know you and I mentioned this after the last meeting. One of the focus groups, or at least some input from, you know, our other elected individuals in town, RTM, BET, especially since we are going to have quite a bit of funding coming forward, making sure that they understand that all of that is required for us to be able to open our schools safely and properly. We're going to obviously have to focus on how to fund a lot of that. So I'd love to be able to make sure that they are given an opportunity for input as well. And I think that you know, I did want to ask, especially since hopefully next week or on Thursday, we'll start speaking a little bit about scheduling, which I know is obviously a bigger concern in middle and high school. It's going to be a little bit more difficult. Making sure, you know, that we have input from educators as well as to how they feel that they can properly teach, just to be back in schools without being able to properly teach. I know, you know, is kind of silly if we can't give the education that is required. The other question I would also like to ask is, I know there's one of the only other things that seemed to be consistent throughout the document from the state was our focus on SEL, and seeing how we can, we have one of the focus groups sort of focusing on ways that we can do that. I know, you know, we certainly can't hire tons of extra social and emotional educators and support staff, therapists and whatever, but how we can put together some stuff for signs and some things parents can help with at home to talk about with their children, proper questions, way to ask them, and a system to support who to contact if our parents feel there's a concern with their child, or for the educators feel that they need to be able to speak to parents, to give them some proper guidance on how to do that. It would be great.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, I think our next meeting, all my days are running together, but I think it's Thursday, right? Make sure. Yes, so next meeting is July 2nd. So not tomorrow, but the next day. And so in the next 2 days before the next meeting, we'll be doing quite a bit of work. And again, I'll try to gain some clarity on this document. Our superintendent's group in this region sent probably about 40 or 50 questions that were to get clarification, because we all had a lot of the same questions. And so hopefully we'll have some more of those answers for you on Thursday morning. So have a wonderful rest of a Tuesday. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.